Welcome to the Teachers Talkin' podcast, hosted by Dustin Tatro and Ghazali Abdul Wahab. In this podcast, we discuss all things education and teaching, from innovative teaching methods to challenges to strategies and much, much more. In this discussion or roundtable-based podcast, we bring in educators from all around the world to talk about a variety of education topics so that we can support as many teachers as possible. We want this to be a place of inspiration, personal and professional development, and simply a place where we can elevate education together. Welcome to Teachers Talkin'. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Teachers Talkin'. As always, I am Dustin, joined by my co-host Ghazali, and today we are diving into a topic that is both thought-provoking and urgent for all educators. Our guest today is Bobby Canosa-Carr, a leadership coach, a former teacher, principal, and public education executive. And Bobby has pioneered work in personalized and project-based learning, restorative practices, and mentoring in schools. And why we're really here today is because he is now the author of the book, Can I Go to the Bathroom? And Other Asinine Questions That We Ask in School. I love this title.
Yeah, I love it too.
It's a book that really challenges the ingrained culture of permission, punishment, and powerlessness in education. So that's why this episode is called Challenging the Status Quo, Education Policy, Advocacy, and Transforming School Culture. We're going to explore how current policies shape our schools and how we can advocate for meaningful change. And so our kind of guiding question today is, what shifts are necessary in education policy and culture to empower students and educators alike? So Bobby, welcome. And if you wouldn't mind starting by just sharing a little bit about your journey in education and, what inspired you to tackle writing this book.
Yeah, thanks, Dustin and Ghazali. Super happy to be here. For me, it really just came down to spending my entire life in schools, right? Like when we really think of it as educators, we have this head start on our careers where, from the age of 4 or 5 or 6 years old, we are already in that workplace. And for me, something always felt wrong. And I think my trajectory in education was different than a lot of people's. I think a lot of folks get into education because they really loved being in school. And when school was over for them, they wanted to continue to find a way to be in school and replicate the types of experiences that felt great to them. I was on the opposite end of that spectrum. Did not like school, didn't like being in school, was always a disruptor in school, not always in the most productive ways, if you were to ask my high school principal for sure. And so when I found myself working in schools, I found that same feeling persisted. Something just felt off about the way we do education. And I'm not going to say that I've figured it out. I think I'm on a path to working with other people to figure it out. But a few years ago, this thought came to me that it had something to do with powerlessness. And so this book actually started for me with just some journaling for myself as I was going through some career shifts. I was trying to change the way I do things and trying to explore why so many people felt powerless in school. And a big aha for me was that it is so pervasive. Students often feel powerless in school, and they're often pointing the finger at the teacher and saying that person has all the power. And they use that power to make me feel unwell in this space. All of us who have been teachers know we've all sat in that teacher's chair and pointed fingers at administrators and at district officials and at legislators and said, these people are taking power from me and making me feel powerless in this space. And even as a principal, the principalship is such a unique job. At one point in my career, I was principal of a large comprehensive high school, where from when I arrived at campus about 6:45 in the morning to when I left, often after the last basketball game or football game, sometimes as late as 10 p.m., I literally never encountered another person who actually had rank over me or could tell me what to do. I was the most powerful person I met every single day on that school campus, and I still felt powerless. I still felt like I didn't have control or the ability to do the things that I thought I needed to do in order to be successful in my work. Now that I'm in a role where I work at a network office, I coach other principals, the feeling is still there. And so this book was my attempt to explore powerlessness in school and figure out what in the world is going on that we all think someone else has all of the power. And I haven't been able to put my finger yet on who it is that's actually sitting there lording this power over us.
Oh, that really resonates with me as a current teacher in the school system. And from what I gather, your book addresses about how permission and punishment dominate the school culture. So I think a good starting point. Why do you think these dynamics persist, and how do they affect students and teachers?
Yeah, I think it's really embodied in the question I put in the title of "Can I go to the bathroom?" which I think is a fascinating question because most of us, at least within the American education system, are so accustomed to when you are in a school, you ask for permission to go to the restroom. And yet, nowhere else in our world is that the case. And so at one point in the book, I imagine a scenario where, a student is just shopping at Target with their mom and realizes they need to go to the restroom. Like, what's going to happen in that situation? That teenager is going to say, "Hey, mom, can you go to the bathroom? I'll be right back. What aisle are you going to be in?" And it's going to be no big deal. There's no permission granted. But I imagine a scenario where regular people in their regular lives actually imitate the structures of schools, where that mom then pulls a clipboard out of her purse and forces her child to sign a clipboard and log the time that they are actually departing her supervision to go to the restroom, where then mom pulls out of a giant tote bag some sort of inordinately large object that you could never actually hold while using the restroom and says, "Make sure you bring this with you in order to prove that you have my permission to go to the bathroom." And there's just such cognitive dissonance when we realize that's the same teenager. The teenager that in any space other than a school, nobody would ever say, "You need to go through these ridiculous protocols in order to obtain permission to go to the bathroom." As soon as they walk onto a school campus, it's just a given. On the first day of school, there are so many things that we could tell our kids about how to be successful in our rooms. And one of the things that never, ever gets skipped is how to go to the bathroom. And so that was actually one of my first journal entries that I started exploring, was that question. And it just was at the same time so silly and so poignant that I started asking myself, what are the other ridiculous questions that come up all the time in school that actually don't reflect our lived experience outside of that? And so one of the other questions that came up that I titled one of the chapters in the book, "What's my grade?" This is something that we are also conditioned in schools to constantly ask, "What's my grade? What's my grade? What's my grade?" It's a part of that culture of powerlessness, where you have a system in place that will punish you if you do not do certain things and reward you if you do other things. That really doesn't replicate the workforce that we're trying to prepare people for. Very few workforces out there, especially the types of jobs that most schools say we're trying to prepare our kids to be successful in, have someone on a daily basis rating their work on a rubric or putting numbers and letters on it. It's particularly interesting in schools because teacher evaluation is always such a hot topic. And we find that school systems try to do the same thing to teachers that we do to kids. We're constantly trying to assign numbers to the value of the work of these human beings. And this is where it really all started coming together for me, was around this question of what's my grade? Because administrators get graded too, not just on their evaluation systems, but in some cases in very public ways. When I look at state dashboards, for example, and I know every state does this a little bit differently. In California, we have a color-coded system where on all these different metrics, the state website gives a grade to each one of these schools. And we really have this obsession with assigning numbers, letters, colors, whatever system it is, to human beings and saying, on a regular basis, this is the value of your work. And it's so disempowering. And it often leaves us showing up to work seeking permission for everything. We're all, both the kids and the adults, asking, can I do this? Am I allowed to do this? In a way that I think stifles creativity, that stifles humanity, that stifles well-being, all of those things. But it's so deeply embedded in our system that for an educator to critique these factors is like a fish trying to critique the ocean. We've all lived in this our entire lives. And how do we even get a vantage point from which we can clearly see the system that has literally shaped our own neurological pathways? This school system taught us how to think. And now we have to do this really hard work of thinking critically about the school system using the patterns of thought that this school system actually embedded in our brains.
There's so much to unpack with all that. But I think it seems like there's just so much change that needs to happen, and like all these types of questions. And it's so funny because as I've been going through the book, like the different questions that pop up are the same types of questions that I have pondered for so long. And in fact, Bobby, I teach at a school now where I just work with kids one-on-one, and I haven't thought much of it, but like we can kind of just, like, kids can take breaks when they need them, et cetera, et cetera. But ever since I picked up your book, I've been readdressing students because they will want to take a break and they'll say, can I go to the bathroom? And I'm like, we're not asking that anymore. Like, you're just another human being. If you got to go to the bathroom, go to the bathroom. Just tell me you got to go to the bathroom. Tell me you'll be back. It's all good.
Yes.
Right. And so, and even for them, it's become, I keep reminding them, I know, Mr. Dustin, I know you said I don't have to, but it's like, it's this reconditioning of saying like, but I think about, like, when I go out and I go to a basketball game or I go to a concert or something, and I turn to my buddy, I'm like, I'll be right back. I'm going to the restroom. It's really that simple.
Yeah.
And so it's such a profound thing. So in any case, it makes me wonder, from your perspective, what would you say are some of the most pressing educational policies then that need reform today in order to address these issues?
Yeah, that's such a great question and such a complex question. The way I wrote this book really shifted multiple times, just down to the basic structure of it, because I think, again, we're all conditioned to think in this way of setting policies and regulating other people, right? And that's the whole thing that this book is often critiquing, is how we regulate other people and tell other people what to do. And I kept finding myself, as I was writing, falling into that trap of, again, telling people what to do, creating regulations and policies, because that's how things work in our society, right? Like, we are trying to use the same types of thinking to solve the problems that were created by those exact types of thinking. And so my big push here, I think one of the things that I don't address directly in the book, but hopefully undergirds the thinking of a lot of readers as they read this, is localization. People have to actually be empowered to make decisions based on their own context. And there are so many tiers to that. That might mean a federal government or a state government giving individual districts abilities to make decisions based on the population within that district. It might mean districts giving that same type of flexibility to schools, and it might mean principals giving that same flexibility for teachers. And then within classrooms, teachers giving that type of flexibility to students and realizing certain students need different levels of structure than others. But the way I wrote the book was really to center the questions rather than the answers. And so one of the things that I think makes this book really unique is that the most important pages of the book are actually blank. it's structured like a workbook, so that there's definitely information there. There's text there. There's ideas to prompt thinking. But I try to make it clear that the words that I'm putting on the pages are not there to tell people what to do or how to think. They're there to prompt their own thinking. And early in the book, I talk about how, in my own experience as a reader, I was a middle school and high school English teacher. And so reading is very important to me. And I've thought a lot about how people read. And when I read a book, a week after I'm done reading the book, if you were to ask me, recite as many facts as you can from that book, tell me as many things as possible that happened in the book, I would not be very impressive in my response. I don't actually remember a lot of the stuff that books tell me as a reader. And I don't know if that's a shared experience with other people or not. But the way my brain works, I just don't remember a lot of this stuff. What I do remember is the thinking that my brain did while I was reading it. And I think sometimes when we read, we mistake our own thinking for what's in there. It's why people end up having grossly different interpretations of the same text, because we're not actually remembering the book itself. We're remembering the thoughts that we had while we were reading that book. I try to really embrace that as an author and create space for people to experience their own thoughts. I recommend that people actually read this book in community. So my dream scenario for the success of this book is not based on individual sales. If I log on to the Amazon portal and I see, hundreds of thousands of people around the world are individually purchasing this book, I mean, sure, that's great. I'm glad these ideas are getting out there, but I don't actually believe that that has the power to transform education. What I do believe is that it's going to have a transformational impact if I start hearing that a group of principals within a district has lobbied their superintendent to say, for our professional development plan this year, we want to have a book club around this. And between our monthly meetings, when we discuss each chapter, we're all going to experiment with different shifts based on the thinking that we did related to this chapter. I'd love to hear the same thing happening in grade level team meetings or department meetings among teachers at schools. I'd love to hear about PTAs and other parent organizations getting together and having dialogue around it. Because I think the solutions will be different depending on the context and depending on the human beings. And I want to leave space for that. I think that as soon as any so-called education expert comes in and says, I have the solution, I'm going to tell you what to do, we're just replicating the same kinds of systems of oppression that are already in place. Because as a species, we're so incredibly diverse. There are so many different people in our schools. I think the starting point is raising awareness and having dialogue rather than agreeing, this is the expert that I believe, and I'll follow the advice of this one person.
Yeah, that would be awesome. And leading up to that, can you share if there are any success stories or schools which have embarked on this approach, which have inspired you to write the book?
Sure, yeah. One of the pieces of feedback I actually got, I had a few folks that I really trust do some reads along the way as I was writing this. And one of the most powerful pieces of feedback I got was from a good friend of mine who read it and said, Bobby, I think it's amazing. It pushed my thinking in so many incredible ways. So much in here that I'd never thought of before. And I won't use his exact word, but he basically said, I left with the feeling that we are screwed. I left with the feeling that it is hopeless, that our system is so foundationally broken that there's no point in doing the work. And that clearly was not my intention in writing this book, to give folks that impression. Yeah. I've always tried as a school leader myself to be someone who really leans into optimism and hope and the belief that we fundamentally can do things differently. And so, and actually, I think a lot of my thinking in this came from some of the work that teams that I've led have done. And that's not to give myself credit, that's to really give credit to those teams. I'm thinking of one particular school in particular that where I was the founding principal. And the way decisions were made was really educators coming together on a regular basis and saying, hey, I tried this thing. This is amazing. Who else wants to try this? Or, oh, this thing that we agreed to try last week, that was a complete nightmare. That did not work. What do we need to do differently? And having that kind of dialogue. And so I did not want anyone to walk out of here feeling like it's hopeless and we can't do things, because I myself have been in schools where I've seen so much progress made. But the push that I got was, give us examples of promising practices. Give us examples of how this is done. And I think that's getting to the question that you're asking is, where is this working? And there are a million different examples. I actually set up a page on my website for folks to share promising practices from their own classrooms and their own schools as they read this book. And so my goal is ultimately to start publicizing some of these practices that are coming out of reading and dialogue around this book. But at the end of every chapter, I did include a section just called Promising Practices, which is not an attempt to say, this is the way to solve the problem, but it's a way to say, here's something that someone out there is doing and seeing some success with. And some of them are really unique and creative, and others of them are ideas that have been out there for quite a while, but just have not taken hold. I think one example is in the chapter called What's My Grade? I talk a little bit about competency-based grading and the fact that a lot of school organizations, I mean, this is not a new thing at all to say, let's get away from arbitrary letters and let's actually score students based on the competencies they're developing, and let's give them multiple opportunities to build competency over time. What blows my mind is that this is still not a common thing, right? This is still not actually the default way of grading in schools. I think that's a really incredibly promising practice to get away from the idea that I am the teacher, I am the expert, I get to say whether you are an A, B, C, D, or F student in my content area, and I get to put that on a piece of paper that will fundamentally change the trajectory of your life in some ways. We can get away from that by basically saying, here is the specific skill that we are attempting to measure. You as the student, I as the teacher, and our broader education system can all agree that, for example, being able to write a counter argument is a valuable skill that educated people should have. And what I'm going to do as your teacher is help you as the student to track your own progress over time and see your growth in that area, with the belief that every single student in the classroom can get to high levels of mastery around that skill. Whereas our typical system that leads to that question of what's my grade comes from a more traditional way of doing things, where I'm going to teach this one time, I'm going to set a date when I'm going to assess you on it, and regardless of whether or not that timeline met your learning needs, regardless of whether or not any of your other needs are being met that day, I'm going to use that one moment in time to assign value to you as a human being in relation to that.
Oh, man. I'm like loving this conversation already, because there's just so much to think about. And so a lot of what Bobby is saying too, Ghazali, I think it aligns with so many other things that we've talked about across the podcast. From grading things to policies to self-pacing and, breaking away from traditional models of teaching. This fits all of the bill. So, I mean, Bobby, you've been a leader in personalized learning, in project-based learning, in meditation. Ghazali, we had on Santa Maria, who talked about meditation for teachers. And then I think in that episode, I talked about being at a school where we meditated twice a day. That was Bobby's school. So I'm curious, Bobby, how do the different approaches, restorative practices is something else that you've been really a big part of. So how do the approaches that you've taken align with the changes that you're advocating for in the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll start with the meditation and mindfulness piece, because that is something that's really deeply important to me, to the point where a couple of years ago, I actually went and got certified as a mindfulness teacher, and actually dedicated significant time to studying under a Zen master, to really get beyond what I think is very common in education, which is surface level implementation that creates bad results out of good ideas. And I think mindfulness in schools is a perfect example of that. It's something that kind of became trendy for a little while, and really, in a lot of cases, lost its value in being sloppily implemented, without any sort of real dedication to helping the people who are implementing it, most of the time teachers, to really develop the competencies they needed to do it well. Often in school districts, we just tell people, oh, do this thing, and we give them a 1-hour training on it and expect them to have the skills to do something completely differently. And I didn't want to fall into that trap. But where the mindfulness piece ties into all of this for me is in generating awareness. So, you know, also, Dustin, like coaching is one of my passions and something I've deeply pursued. One of the biggest ahas that I've had on my journey as a coach is that the role of a coach is not to tell someone a better way to do things, but to spark new awareness in the person that they're coaching. I really believe that when people have awareness of things that they weren't aware of before, that gives them the opportunity to then shift their patterns of thought. And it's not until people shift their patterns of thought that people shift their patterns of behavior in meaningful ways. I think mindfulness is a huge tool in sparking awareness. I think all of us that have been in any sort of coaching or supervisory conversation with a teacher know that if you're trying to squeeze in this coaching conversation in a teacher's conference period, often to make the connection back to the book, when they need to even just like desperately get to the bathroom before their next class starts, right? Or get their lunch or meet their basic physiological needs, and you're trying to sit them down, in some cases, their amygdala is completely hijacked. They're in fight or flight mode at that point. They have been dealing with all sorts of variables throughout the course of the day. And then we're going to try to get someone to change their patterns of behavior in a 20-minute conversation. It's not going to happen. And yet, we're also not going to get to a place to where teacher schedules, at least within the type of funding model we have in most states in this country, where teacher schedules actually accommodate the type of time for deep reflection and deep connection. Mindfulness is a tool that can support with that, right? We know that using mindfulness strategies can quickly de-escalate some of the catastrophizing that happens in our heads, especially when we are in school classrooms, can calm our nervous system down and can position us to actually think more deeply, reflect more deeply, engage more deeply in meaningful dialogue. And so for me, that's a tool to help do this work. Because even in the scenario I talked about before, where a grade level team embraces this book as a text that they're going to do a book club around, if they're trying to squeeze this into short periods of time between a million other priorities, when they are not in the emotional or psychological space to reflect deeply, it's going to have zero impact. And so we use tools like mindfulness to accelerate the process of getting people positioned to do the thinking that they need to do. I would put restorative practices in that same bucket. Often relationships are strained at schools because of all the factors I just mentioned. We're stressed out all the time. We are feeling oppressed all the time. It's the powerlessness thing, right? When we feel powerless, when we feel oppressed, and like I said before, almost everybody in schools feels oppressed in some way or another. Relationships are strained. It's hard to connect. And for me, restorative practices are not about replacing traditional punitive discipline. Like that's only a small part of it. The real value of restorative practices is helping us build systems for forming and maintaining community. And that's not just among the young people, that's among the adults as well. And so in this book, I really emphasize that learning is best done in community for both kids and adults. And restorative practices are really a powerful tool for helping us to build strong community in which to learn together.
Oh, I think that is really very insightful, and you are describing something which is a total change for many schools in terms of the systems and values that are inherent in those institutions. So, what would your advice be then for teachers in those kind of schools? How then do they make their voices heard in shaping the education policy within the school, if that is already been the established school culture for so long?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Trying to figure out how to answer that because there are so many different angles. I mean, the complexity of that question is off the charts. And there are a million different ways that I could answer it because there are a million different approaches that we could take.
Yes.
The first one that came to mind that is certainly not my final word on this is find a space where people are willing and interested in partnering with you. If you are working for a school, a district, a charter management organization that seems particularly opposed to empowering teachers, find a space that welcomes you and that's open to that. And I will also say that there is no space out there that I'm aware of, at least, that is sort of ready-made for it. And I want to advise people against the mentality that the grass is greener on the other side. Because I've also seen a lot of educators, both teachers and administrators, say, I feel disempowered here, I'm leaving, and then go to another organization that they find is similar or problematic in a different set of ways. So to your question, I think that there is a part of it that rests on the shoulders of each of us as an individual educator to find our own empowerment. A part of that comes from showing up the way we want other people to show up. And this may not be a popular response because nobody who is feeling disempowered wants to hear, it starts with you. We have a tendency as human beings to point to other people, which is why the last chapter of this book is called Why Is It Always My Fault? Which is a chapter about how we blame one another within the system. But I do think one part of this process of finding empowerment within our work as educators is to really become aware of how we are showing up in relation to other people. When we show up in a way that simply tries to reverse or subvert power structures, we're really just reinforcing the same thing. When we have organizations, and there are so many school systems out there where there's just a fundamental battle of teachers versus administrators, and it's like on the level of like a good versus evil type of thing where everybody's pointing fingers at the other side. We naturally are kind of programmed through evolution to find community with those that we have most in common with, which is usually the role-alike people. Say that these are my community, these are the people I'm safe with, and anyone outside of this is the enemy, and I will fight the enemy. I tend to believe that actually just strengthens the systems of oppression that are causing the situation in the first place. The more we simply say, you have power, so I'm going to try to take it from you, the more we're reinforcing the idea that schools do in fact run on power structures, and the only way to be empowered is to disempower somebody else. I think that if we show up as being fundamentally collaborative, if we show up in ways that are patient with one another, if we constantly ask ourselves questions like, this person who I feel is disempowering me, what are they going through? What are they experiencing that might be informing their behavior or causing them to behave in that way? And we try to get at those root causes, even from a position that is lower on the hierarchy. It's possible for a principal, for example, to approach a superintendent with compassion, to approach a superintendent from the point of view of this person is clearly experiencing something, has lived experiences that are telling them to behave in this way and to take power from me. What are those conditions, and is there anything that I can do, even if it's just lifting one straw from the camel's back? We always talk about adding another straw to the camel's back. We never talk about removing a straw from the camel's back. And when we look at one another, when administrators look at teachers and say, there's so much weight on them, what straw can I lift from them? What one piece of weight? And when teachers look at their administrators in the same way, say, how can I make their lives a little bit easier? Like I said, that might not be the most popular perspective, because nobody wants to help the person that they perceive to be taking power from them. But I fundamentally believe that that type of compassion and a willingness to show up and be of service to one another, regardless of the power dynamics, is a huge step in dismantling those power dynamics.
So we've discussed about the dismantling part and the pros and cons of that process. How about empowering? How do teachers empower themselves? How do teachers find the agency to do things when you are within this power structure, an organization which is so authoritarian and dogmatic? How do teachers reclaim some of their agency so that, they can get by day to day and having a feeling of satisfaction and being motivated and engaged and saying, hey, this success with my kids is because of the things I chose to do and the way that I carried it out. And nobody told me that this has to be done in this way. It was my own initiative. And so the success of the students are also my successes,
Yeah, I love that. I love that framing. And I think your question points to the answer, which is partnership with students. It is so natural for so many of us as human beings when we feel disempowered to then in turn disempower someone else, which happens all the time. And it's sometimes uncomfortable. I did have several teachers read early drafts of this book, and I had some uncomfortable conversations with some folks because some of my friends that read this book initially had concerns about, could this be interpreted as you are putting the blame on teachers? And I really wanted this to come across as, no, this is not about blame. This is about a systemic challenge. But if I just simply adopt the narrative that all teachers are heroes simply by virtue of having that job title, all teachers are always doing the right thing simply by virtue of sort of being a part of this heroic profession, then I'm actually contributing to their disempowerment. By saying, here's the role that administrators play in this dynamic, here's the role that teachers play in this dynamic, here's the role that students play in this dynamic, we've got to take shared ownership and shared accountability. And we've got to admit that there absolutely are classrooms in which those same power dynamics that play out between districts and teachers, administrators and teachers, also play out between teachers and students. There are absolutely classrooms where teachers and students are not always working in an ideal partnership. And I think that if we can really figure out how to build strong partnerships between teachers and students to where students actually feel the same types of conditions that teachers want to feel in schools. Everybody, regardless of what position you hold, wants to show up to school feeling like they have some degree of choice over their lived experience that day. Everybody wants to feel like their foundational needs are being met. And yet, we see so many classrooms where the foundational needs of students are being denied, where we've got students that are sitting there being physically uncomfortable. Myself, I'm particularly tall. I was 6'4" by 8th grade. So for myself, sitting in an old wooden desk in a Catholic school, which is where I went to school in 8th grade, with a nun, like a literal nun, hovering over me and saying, sit up straight, Bobby. can still remember her Irish accent to this day, demanding that I sit up straight in this old wooden desk. I was physically being tortured, like it hurt. And we set up so many of these conditions, like regulating students' bodies, regulating when they can go to the bathroom, regulating when they can eat or drink. And I'm not advocating for everybody do whatever you want, whenever you want. That would be chaos. But when there are times that the system tells teachers to treat students in the exact same way that teachers are often telling the system we ourselves don't want to be treated, we are centering the humanity of one group and marginalizing the humanity of another group. And that is not unique to the teacher-student relationship. That is just fundamental to the power structure across the board, where I think a huge percentage of the human beings who show up to schools every day have been taught by the system that in order to center my humanity, I have to marginalize the humanity of another person. I think that if we start actually centering the humanity of other people, what will happen in classrooms is you'll see these powerful partnerships emerge between students, families, and teachers, where those students and their families will become massive advocates for those teachers. If kids show up to school every day feeling this is a space where I am seen, I am loved, I am cared for, I am nurtured, my physiological needs are being met, my emotional needs are being met, my developmental needs are being met, that's going to form bonds that are incredibly powerful. And in the event where you actually have oppressive practices happening at the administrative level, those types of partnerships really have the power to then confront those practices and engage in real dialogue around it. And so I think sometimes our natural instinct to go straight to what we perceive as the source of our suffering and fight against it is actually not the most productive thing. Sometimes it's the counterintuitive approach of how do I avoid passing on or replicating these systems of oppression to others? How do I think, instead of focusing on my own powerlessness, how do I actually center others and think about their powerlessness and work with them towards true well-being? And I just believe that by doing that for others, I can't imagine that that's not actually going to create better conditions for ourselves as well, and send messages to the system as a whole that this is how we as human beings treat other human beings.
Whew. Wow. You could go
about that point.
on and on here. There's so much here. Wow. Well, Bobby, as we start to wrap things up, even though I feel like we could talk for hours and we may have to just do this again, what would you say is maybe just one takeaway that you hope listeners get from today's conversation about, rethinking school culture and policy?
Do the work together. Do the work in community. Our system is so intent on separating us and making us feel like we are the only ones experiencing the challenges that we're experiencing. Bring together your people, find a community that shares your experiences, and just do the work, do the thinking, and commit to trying things out and seeing how small changes in your daily patterns of behavior can actually impact the bigger systems that sometimes feel immovable.
Incredible. Well, Bobby, thank you so much for coming on and joining us and having this conversation today. It's been incredibly insightful. I think there's so much for all of us to be thinking about and trying to figure out, how do we start to make these small changes so that we can start to make larger changes. So really appreciate you just coming on and having this conversation today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate being here. Great conversation, guys, and keep up the really good work.
It's great talking to you, Bobby.
You too.
To our listeners, as always, thank you for tuning in to Teachers Talking. If you enjoyed today's episode, as I know you did, please don't forget to like, subscribe, leave reviews, share the podcast. And you can also check out Bobby's book, Can I Go to the Bathroom? For more transformative ideas. The link will be in the show note descriptions. So again, thank you everybody for being here, and we will see you next time on Teachers Talking.